My name is Elira Wynne, and if you've ever been the one who always showed up, stayed quiet, and put everyone else first, then you might recognize a little of yourself in me. I used to believe keeping the peace meant keeping my place in the family, but sometimes silence becomes its own kind of wound. And one day, you look around and realize you've been written out of a story you helped build. Stay with me through the end of this story. Then tell me honestly, did I make the right choice? Would you have done the same? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. I still remember that morning, one of those late March Fridays where the chill lingers a little longer than it should. I had placed a bouquet of yellow tulips right in the middle of the shop entrance, thinking it might be the first thing people saw when they walked in. Bright, hopeful, reaching toward the light. I told myself it was a symbol, a fresh start. The shop smelled like jasmine and old wood, my favorite mix. I'd spent the night before scrubbing the counters, arranging display buckets, even handwriting little name tags for each flower bunch. Petal and quiet. That's what I named it. It sounded soft, like a promise I once made to myself in my 30s, somewhere between my mother's hip surgery and my sister's third breakup. I was 45 now. I had finally done it. Opened the flower shop I'd been dreaming of since I was a girl pressing dandelions in phone books. Took me long enough. Most of my adult life had been built around someone else's emergencies. I was the dependable one, the one who always picked up the phone. When Mom needed rides to the clinic, when Maurice lost another job, when the hot water broke at the house again, I showed up. Always. Even when I was married, I was only half present. I'd be cooking dinner while on speakerphone with Mom, or texting Maris from the passenger seat while my husband tried to talk about our mortgage. He used to say, "You give away all your good parts before you come home." I hated how true that sounded. Now it was just me. After the divorce, I moved to Maple Falls, Oregon, a sleepy town with more trees than traffic. I rented a modest apartment above a bookstore and saved every penny from my dull administrative job at a dental clinic. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and it gave me enough to chase this old dream. So when the opening day came, I expected nothing extravagant. Just a small crowd, some neighbors, maybe a couple of local business owners who got my handwritten invitations. But more than anything, I thought my family would be there. At least Mom. At least March. I made cookies, arranged a table with tea and lemonade, and even put on that green wrap dress I'd been saving for someday special. The doorbell chimed a few times. An elderly couple from down the street, a college kid who asked about baby's breath. Sweet people, kind, but none of them had my last name. I kept glancing toward the door. Every time it opened, my heart did a little hop, and then a little fall. They're probably just running late, I told myself. Mom might have gotten turned around again. Maris probably had trouble finding a sitter. But when the sun dipped low and the lemonade turned warm, I knew. They weren't coming. I smiled through it. I laughed too loudly at strangers' jokes. I thanked every visitor like they were royalty. I even kept rearranging the tulips, like it would make the waiting easier. At one point, I caught my reflection in the shop mirror. My lipstick had faded. My eyes looked tired. Behind me, on the back wall, hung a small decorative sign someone had gifted me years ago. It read, "Family is everything." The words felt like a whisper from someone who had never actually met my family. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in a corner booth at Birch and Brew, the only cafe in town that made chamomile tea without rushing it. I was scrolling aimlessly through my phone, trying to avoid the silence in my chest. And then I saw it. A photo, bright, sharp, screaming joy. Maris in a white lace gown, holding a bouquet that looked suspiciously like one of my own arrangements. Mom stood next to her, glowing. Behind them, a garden full of people I recognized. Cousins. Aunt Lynn from Sacramento. Even that neighbor who used to babysit us. The caption read, "The most beautiful day of my life." I stared at it longer than I meant to. Not a single word from them. No call, no text. No invitation that got lost in the mail. Just a post. For everyone but me. I set the phone down gently, like it might explode. My hands stayed in my lap, still, calm, but something inside me, something I had buried long ago under layers of "it's okay" and "they didn't mean it," shifted. And in that quiet moment, something else arrived too. Not rage, not sadness, clarity. I didn't cry. Not the day I saw the photo. Not that night. Not the day after. Instead, I found myself walking in slow circles around my apartment, picking things up and putting them back down. Mail, a chipped mug, a cardigan I hadn't worn since last fall. My body moved, but my mind was stuck on one question. What did I do that was so terrible I didn't deserve to be invited? I kept replaying old scenes in my head. The time I drove Maurice 2 hours to an interview and waited in the car for 3. The night I stayed up with her after her fiancé left, feeding her soup, holding her while she sobbed. I even remembered her 18th birthday, how I bought her that blush pink satin dress she swore she couldn't live without. I still remembered how tightly she hugged me that night. Back then, I thought it meant something. Maybe it didn't. I didn't know what else to do, so I called my mother. I hadn't spoken to her since the shop opening. She answered on the third ring. "Elira," she said, casual, like I was calling to check on her garden. I cleared my throat. "Hi, Mom, I saw the pictures." She went quiet for a beat, and then let out a sigh like I'd already inconvenienced her. "Oh, you mean Maris's wedding, I waited." I thought maybe she'd say it was last minute, or that they meant to invite me, but something happened. Maybe she'd tell me the mailman screwed up, or she assumed I wouldn't want to come. But no. She didn't want a big fuss, my mother said lightly. She asked for a small gathering, just people she felt comfortable with. I felt my chest tighten. "But I'm her sister." There was another pause, and then the words that would stay with me long after the call ended. "She said you'd bring too much drama. She wanted it to be a light, happy day." I didn't respond. Couldn't. Mom went on, her voice as calm as if she were reading off a grocery list. "She was afraid you'd make things about yourself. Or get emotional. You know how you get sometimes." I swallowed hard. I would have just been there, quiet, supportive. "Well," she said, almost cheerfully, "sometimes just being there is enough to shift the whole mood. You know that, don't you?" And then, like a cherry on top, she added, "Don't take it personally, honey. You're too sensitive. It wasn't that serious." Not that serious. Not serious that my mother didn't stand up for me. Not serious that my sister rewrote our entire history so I'd be the villain in her big day. I ended the call with some mumbled version of "okay" and stood in the kitchen, staring at the ceramic sugar jar I never used. My heart wasn't breaking. It had already been cracked for years. This was just the part where I finally noticed the pieces on the floor. I needed air. I left the apartment and walked without thinking. It wasn't until I caught the scent of cinnamon and butter that I realized where I'd ended up. Sweet Mendel's. I hadn't stepped into Tasha's bakery in nearly a decade. We used to be inseparable in high school. She was my safe person. Funny, steady, always good with silence. We drifted after college, mostly because I was always too busy. Too busy being the daughter who did it all. Too busy cleaning up family messes. The bell above the bakery door jingled as I pushed it open. Tasha looked up from the counter and blinked. Surprised, but not cold. "Elira?" she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You look like someone just told you Hallmark went bankrupt." I let out a soft, broken laugh. That might have been easier to swallow. She made us tea. She sat with me in the little corner booth, next to the display of apple tarts and almond croissants. And when I told her what happened, about the wedding, the words my mother said, she didn't interrupt, didn't gasp, didn't try to fix it. She just listened. When I finally stopped talking, Tasha leaned back and said, "I remember your mom canceling my 16th birthday sleepover. Said family emergency. I waited up with the cake for hours." I blinked. "I never knew," I whispered. "Yeah," she shrugged. "It was always something with them. I used to think, if Elira's not showing up, She must have a good reason. But now, I wonder if they just never made space for you. Her words landed hard. I always told myself, I said quietly, if I didn't step up, who would? But now I keep wondering, how much stepping up is too much? At what point are you just the doormat? Tasha nodded, reaching over to squeeze my hand. You can love people and still admit they've hurt you, she said. It doesn't make you cruel, it makes you honest. And right then, I realized, maybe it wasn't just the wedding that broke something in me. Maybe it was the realization that it had been broken for a long, long time. I told myself I wasn't going to reach out, that I didn't owe her anything, but silence has a way of getting inside your ribs, poking at you when the world goes quiet. Late one evening, when the shop was closed and the streets outside had that kind of stillness that only small towns know, I picked up my phone and typed the message before I could talk myself out of it. Did you really not want me there, Maris? I stared at it for a minute, thumb hovering. Then I hit send. She replied within the hour. I just wanted a calm, simple day, she wrote. No pressure, no tension, just joy. I blinked at the screen. My fingers were suddenly cold. I typed, so you think I would have ruined that? 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then came her answer. Honestly, you always find a way to make things about you, Alara. This was supposed to be my day. I sat back on the couch, heart thudding slow and heavy. Her words stung more than I thought they would. I wasn't prepared for that kind of bluntness. Or maybe I was. Maybe I just didn't want to admit it. I never asked for attention, I wrote back. I just showed up. I was always there. For you, for Mom, for everything. You were always there, sure, she replied. But you had this way of sucking the air out of the room. Even when you were quiet, you made it about you. I didn't want that at my wedding. I dropped the phone in my lap and stared at the wall. A framed print of lavender fields hung above my kitchen counter. Something I bought at a local craft fair years ago. It used to make me feel calm. Tonight, it felt like a lie. All I could think about was the day I emptied my savings account so Maurice could register for her final semester of college. I didn't even blink, just handed her the check and told her I believed in her. I remembered steaming her graduation gown, tying the little ribbons around her favors, snapping photos while Mom mingled. I didn't ask for recognition. I just wanted her to feel celebrated. Apparently, she only remembered the way I existed and resented me for it. Suddenly, memories began tumbling out, like someone had knocked over a shelf in my head. Last Christmas, I'd spent hours prepping a meal, only to find out Mom and Maris had already done a little dinner the night before. We didn't want to overwhelm you, Mom had said. You've been so busy with the flower shop stuff. It felt kind at the time. Or maybe I just wanted it to. Or the year Mom turned 65 and held a brunch at Maris's house without telling me. It was a last-minute thing, she explained, when I found out through a Facebook tag. We didn't think you'd be able to make it anyway. It all came rushing back. So many small moments, brushed aside, explained away, layered in false kindness, each one tiny on its own, but together they made a pattern. I wasn't just forgotten, I was deliberately left out. At some point, I'd stopped being a person to them. I had become a utility, someone they could rely on, until I became inconvenient. Later that week, I got a message from Aunt Doreen, one of our distant cousins. She had posted in the wedding photo thread, and I guess she saw that I hadn't commented. Hey, sweetie, she wrote. We missed you at the wedding. Heard you couldn't make it. Everything okay? I stared at the message for a long time. Read it 3 times. Heard the lie echo in my ears. They told people I couldn't make it. Not that I wasn't invited. They had rewritten the story before I even had a chance to speak. I didn't reply to Doreen right away. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't unravel me. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my old recipe box, the one Mom gave me when I moved out. Inside were handwritten cards, most of them in her tight cursive. I found the one for banana bread, pulled it out, and stared at the smudge of cinnamon where my thumb once pressed. Funny how something so ordinary could carry so much weight. That night, I didn't cry either, but I did finally understand something. I had spent most of my life trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I was too much of something, or not enough of something else. Too sensitive, too serious, too present, but never enough to be wanted, never enough to be invited. I didn't plan to write it. I wasn't looking for attention or sympathy. I just needed somewhere to put the ache, somewhere quieter than my thoughts, but louder than the silence I'd been carrying. My blog had sat untouched for years, buried beneath a dozen passwords I almost forgot. It used to be a space for flower arrangements, soft poems, and musings about coffee beans. But that day, it became something else entirely. The post was titled, "Does peaceful now mean leaving out the ones who sacrificed for you?" I sat at my kitchen table in the fading afternoon light, the scent of day-old tulips still hanging in the air. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure where to begin. And then I just started. I didn't name names. I didn't point fingers. I wrote about a woman who opened her dream flower shop and waited for family who never came. A woman who learned, days later, that her sister had gotten married in a garden filled with people, but not her. I wrote about being called too emotional, when all she ever did was care deeply. I wrote about how love, when weaponized, starts to feel like guilt disguised as loyalty. The words spilled out, unfiltered, the way rain finally falls after a long, heavy sky. When I finished, I didn't read it back. I just hit publish. No tags, no fanfare. Just my truth, floating into the digital void like a message in a bottle. I thought maybe a few people would read it. Old high school acquaintances, maybe Tasha. I didn't expect anything more. But the next morning, I opened my phone to hundreds of notifications. Comments, shares, direct messages. By lunch, the post had over 1,000 shares. By dinner, I couldn't keep up. Women, mostly older, mostly quiet like me, started writing. I wasn't invited to my son's second wedding because his new wife thought I'd be too much. My sister told me not to speak at our father's funeral, said I'd make people uncomfortable. I bought my daughter her first car. She still didn't invite me to her bridal shower. One message simply said, "Thank you for saying what I've been swallowing for years." I sat there stunned. Not because I'd gone viral, but because I realized I wasn't alone. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of us. Women who had spent our lives being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who stayed late and cleaned up after everyone else. Women who had become invisible the moment we stopped bending. And in their messages, I heard echoes of my own life. Later that evening, Tasha came by with 2 lemon bars and a look on her face that said she'd been holding something in. "You blew up the internet," she said, sliding one of the bars across the counter. I smiled weakly. "Didn't mean to." "No," she said, sitting across from me. "You meant to tell the truth. That's different." I looked at her, unsure what to say. There was a lump in my throat the size of a stone. Tasha leaned in slightly. "You're not selfish, Elira. You're just finally learning how to take up space." I hadn't thought of it that way. For years, I believed my worth came from shrinking, from fitting into the cracks between other people's needs, from not asking for too much, from apologizing before I even knew if I'd done anything wrong. But this felt different, like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath for most of my adult life. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen, not for the scent, but for the symbolism. A small flame in a quiet room, proof that something still burned in me. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if my mother had seen the post, or Maris, or anyone else in my family. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't care. What mattered was this. Somewhere out there, a woman sat on her porch, reading my words, feeling a little less crazy and a little less alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The call came just before noon, right as I was trimming hydrangeas in the back room. My phone lit up with Mom across the screen. I let it ring twice, then picked up. "You happy now?" Her voice snapped through the receiver like a rubber band. No hello, no pause, just accusation. Excuse me? I said quietly, already bracing. That blog of yours, she hissed. You embarrassed this family. You humiliated Maris. What were you thinking, airing dirty laundry like that? I stood very still. Water dripped slowly from the sink behind me. I was thinking about the truth, I said. You want truth? She snapped. The truth is, you made everything about you, always have. Maris wanted one peaceful day, just one, and you couldn't even give her that. I swallowed hard, feeling the familiar pull to explain myself, to say something that would smooth it all over. But the words didn't come. Not this time. She didn't even invite me, I finally said, flat, because she knew how you'd react. And look, she was right. Her voice dropped into something colder. You could have kept this private, but instead, you wrote some manifesto. Now people are calling me, asking what happened. You made us look like villains. I closed my eyes. There it was again. The shift. I wasn't the one hurt. I was the one causing trouble. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just said, Mom, I didn't write that for anyone's approval. I wrote it because I needed to. She laughed, short and bitter. You're unbelievable, after everything we've done for you. Something inside me cracked a little. I could hear the words forming in my chest, sharp, fiery words I'd swallowed for years. But I didn't let them out. I simply said, I'm not taking it down. Her silence was louder than her yelling. You always were dramatic, she finally muttered. You think this makes you strong? It makes you pathetic. And then, click, she hung up. I stood there for a long time, phone still in my hand, arms slack at my side. I expected to feel regret, guilt, shame, but instead there was only a dull sort of ache, like a bruise you forgot you had until someone pressed it. For most of my life, I had played my part. Quiet, dependable, agreeable. I was the one who baked the pies, who drove the miles, who bit her tongue. And somehow, I was still the problem. I set the phone down and walked to the front of the shop, where the sunlight spilled over the window display. The tulips had started to open, brilliant and soft, unaware of the storm behind the scenes. A few hours later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Aunt Rachel, my mom's cousin on the maternal side. We hadn't spoken in years, not since some forgotten family barbecue. Her message read, I just read your blog. I had no idea. I'm sorry. I blinked, then scrolled down. Attached was a photo, an image of Maris's wedding invitation, the one I never received. Rachel's message continued, I was confused why you weren't there, but when I read the envelope again, I noticed this. At the bottom of the invitation, in small, handwritten print, it read, Please don't forward this to Elira. She's not on the list. I stared at it for a long time, barely breathing. I enlarged the photo, then zoomed in again, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. There it was, clear as day. My name, deliberately excluded. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding, a choice. Rachel added one last line. I'm so sorry, honey. I thought you knew. I wish I'd asked sooner. I didn't respond right away. My hands were shaking, not with rage, but with the quiet realization that no apology would undo this. No explanation would make it okay. I sat down in the armchair by the front window, letting the late afternoon light warm my face, and I let myself feel it fully, not just the sadness, but the finality. This wasn't a one-time oversight. It was a pattern, a decision, a declaration. I wasn't part of the family story anymore. And maybe that was finally okay. The second blog post came to me around midnight, when the house was still and my thoughts weren't. I sat in bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence like background music. I didn't write it out of anger. Not this time. I wrote it because I needed to hear myself say it, clearly, without apology. The title, Do I Still Respect Myself If I Stay Silent? It wasn't a call-out. No names, no accusations. Just a quiet reckoning. I wrote about how silence had been my safety net for years. How I let things slide. How I swallowed hard feelings, tucked them under politeness, and told myself I was being the bigger person. I wrote, "Forgiveness is not the same as tolerance. It's not permission to keep hurting someone just because they don't fight back." I hit publish, then closed the laptop without rereading a word. The next morning, I met Tasha for coffee at Birch and Brew. She was already seated at our usual table, stirring cream into her cup like it was a slow ritual. "You look lighter," she said when I sat down. "Maybe I am," I said. "Or maybe I've just stopped holding my breath." We talked for a while, about customers, the cold weather, her new cinnamon scones. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "You know, my dad used to call me selfish every time I set a boundary." I looked up, surprised. She'd never spoken much about him. "He wasn't physically abusive," she continued, "just controlling. Everything was about him, his moods, his comfort. The minute I stopped tiptoeing, I was cruel. So I moved out at 19 and never went back." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "That must have been hard." "It was," she nodded, "but not as hard as staying." There was a long pause, and then she asked gently, "If a stranger treated you the way your mom and Maris have, would you let them stay in your life?" I didn't answer right away. I stared out the window at the gray sky, at the frost creeping along the corners of the glass. My fingers tightened around the warm ceramic mug. "No," I finally said, "I wouldn't." Tasha didn't say anything. She didn't have to. That afternoon, I sat in the back room of the flower shop, surrounded by the scent of eucalyptus and garden roses, and opened my phone. I started with my mother. I went to her contact, scrolled past old messages, birthday reminders, recipe links, guilt-laced, just checking in texts, and hit block. Then I did the same with Maris. Then the three aunts who had shared photos from the wedding. The cousin who commented, "Too bad you couldn't make it," as if that were the whole story. Each tap of the screen felt like peeling off a heavy coat I'd been wearing for far too long. When I finished, I put the phone down, leaned back in my chair, and let out a breath so deep it shook something loose in my chest. I had never done that before. I had never chosen myself over keeping the peace, never stood that firmly in the discomfort without trying to fix it. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a tantrum. It was clarity. It was survival. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to understand me. I wasn't hoping for a text, a call, an apology. I was simply done. That night, as I walked home beneath a sky dusted with stars, I didn't feel sad. I felt empty in a way that made space for something new. She showed up on a Tuesday. The wind had been biting all morning, sharp enough to sting my fingers every time I stepped outside to adjust the display. The town was quiet, just the occasional scrape of boots on sidewalk and the low hum of passing cars. I was sorting through a fresh batch of ranunculus when I heard the bell over the door chime. I looked up, and there she was. Maris stood at the threshold like she wasn't sure she belonged there. Her coat was expensive, her hair pulled into a sleek bun, and her arms were crossed like armor. But it was her eyes that caught me off guard. They looked tired, not apologetic, just worn out. "I'm not here to fight," she said. I nodded slowly, not offering her a smile. "Okay." She took a few cautious steps inside, glanced around the shop like she was seeing it, even though I'd emailed her pictures months ago, long before I stopped trying. "It's nice," she said, gesturing vaguely. "You've always had a good eye." "Thanks," I said, voice flat. I didn't offer her coffee, didn't ask how she was. She stood near the counter, fingers toying with the strap of her purse. I thought maybe we could talk, like adults." I raised an eyebrow. "Were we not adults before?" Maris exhaled, annoyed. "Elira, come on." "You came here. You wanted to talk," I said calmly. "So talk." "I just wanted to explain," she began. "The wedding. It wasn't meant to hurt you. I just. I didn't want any drama. I didn't want things to be heavy. It was supposed to be my day." I looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You know what's funny? You say I made everything heavy. But you handed out invitations with a note that said, 'Don't send this to Alira.' That doesn't sound peaceful. That sounds calculated." She winced, just barely. "I was scared you'd make a scene. I didn't even know there was a scene to make." Her mouth tightened. "You're twisting things." "No," I said. "For once, I'm just not shrinking." She stared at me like I was speaking another language, like she didn't recognize me. "I get it, okay?" she snapped. "You've always felt like the underdog, like no one appreciated you. But you don't have to play the victim every time something doesn't go your way." I let out a breath, not angry, not emotional, just done. "I'm not playing anything," I said softly. "I'm not a victim. I'm someone who survived a lifetime of being useful, but never welcome." Silence fell over the shop. Outside, snow had started to drift past the window in slow, lazy swirls. The kind of snow that looked pretty, but carried cold in its bones. Maris broke the silence with a shrug. "So what now? You're just cutting everyone off?" I didn't answer right away. I looked past her, toward the front window, where a bouquet of yellow tulips sat in a frosted glass vase. Still upright, still bright, despite the winter chill seeping through the pane. "I'm choosing peace," I said. "Real peace. Not the kind that comes from pretending everything's fine, just to keep people comfortable." She gave a small scoff. "You think you're better than us now?" I met her gaze. But I finally think I'm enough." There was nothing else to say. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just turned toward the door and walked out with that same stiff grace she always carried, like nothing could touch her unless she let it. The bell chimed behind her, and then it was just me and the flowers, and the quiet hum of heat from the old radiator. I walked over to the window and adjusted the tulips, running a finger gently along the soft edge of a petal. Still fresh. Still standing. And so was I. Summer crept into Maple Falls like a secret, quiet and golden, warming the corners of my shop and softening the petals of every bloom. The cold was finally gone, but its echo still lived somewhere in me. Grief, I've learned, doesn't leave with the seasons. It just changes its shape. Petal and quiet had found its rhythm. Locals stopped in regularly, teachers, retirees, the waitress from the diner down the block. Some came for flowers, some just for the peace. I started writing little notes to tuck into bouquets, gentle affirmations, a habit that felt more like healing than marketing. I called them flowers for the ones who stayed. One Tuesday morning, Tasha showed up with a cinnamon bun the size of my hand and a spark in her eye. "I have an idea," she said, dropping into the shop's armchair like she owned it. "Let's do a workshop at the bakery, flowers and frosting. We'll call it Loving Yourself Loudly. You arrange, I bake, women only." I blinked, then grinned. "You always were the brains in this operation." She winked. "You were the heart. I just followed it." A week later, a girl no older than 23 stepped timidly into the shop. Her name was Erin. She didn't buy anything, just walked up to the counter and said, "I read your blog." The second one. I hadn't spoken to my mom in 7 years, but last night I called her, just to say I exist, and that I'm tired of pretending I don't. She didn't stay long, but when she left, she took one yellow daisy and whispered, "Thank you." I thought about her for days. And then the letter came. It was a pale blue envelope, addressed in a familiar hand. My mother's handwriting hadn't changed in decades. Tight loops, too much pressure on the pen. My stomach tightened as I opened it. "No, dear Elira. No love, Mom. Just a few lines. We're holding a remembrance gathering for your father next Sunday. It would be respectful if you came." I held the note in both hands, rereading it twice. My father had been gone 6 years. This wasn't an anniversary. It wasn't his birthday. Just a moment she had decided we should all gather again, perhaps to show unity, perhaps for something else. I felt the weight of that single word. Respectful. As if my presence was a duty, a gesture, a box to check. Not an invitation of love, but of appearance. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time, just breathing. Part of me wanted to go. Not for her, not even for him, but for that small voice inside that still whispered, "What if they change? What if this time they finally see you?" And yet, I knew that voice well. It had led me into 100 tiny heartbreaks. So I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer beneath my tea bags. I didn't tear it up. I didn't throw it out. I just put it away. That afternoon, as I was closing the shop, I stepped outside and looked at the chalkboard I'd once carefully lettered. Family is everything. It used to feel like a prayer. Now it felt like a warning. I picked up the cloth and wiped it clean. The dust clung to my fingertips, soft as ash. In its place, I wrote slowly, each word clear. You deserve to belong where you are loved. As I stood back to look at it, a tourist passing by paused and lifted her phone. "That's beautiful," she said. "Mind if I take a picture?" "Go ahead," I said. "Maybe someone else needs to see it." She smiled and snapped the photo. I watched her walk away, and for a moment, I wondered who would be in that room next Sunday, sitting in a circle, talking about my father. I wondered if anyone would ask where I was, if Mom would make excuses, if Maris would pretend not to notice. But then I thought about Aaron, and Tasha, and the women who came to my shop just to breathe. I thought about the tulips that bloomed even through frost, and I thought, maybe this is what staying looks like. Maybe I am the one who stayed, with myself, at last. Still, I wonder, would you have gone? Would you have walked back into that room? Or would you have done what I did? Finally choose peace over pretending? Honestly, I'd love to hear your answer. I guess what I've learned is this. Sometimes walking away isn't giving up. It's growing up. It's realizing that love without respect isn't really love at all. And maybe you felt that too. Maybe you've stayed too long in a space that asked you to shrink, just to keep others comfortable. If this story found its way into a quiet corner of your heart, I hope it reminded you, you're not alone, and you never were. If it touched something in you, I'd be honored to have you with me again in the stories to come.